BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's more or less in half an hour. But now, Last Word with Matthew Bannister.
On Last Word this week...
How could you do a thing like that? When I was just going to give you coffee.
Bryan Forbes, director of The Stepford Wives, Whistle Down the Wind and many other British films. Hayley Mills pays tribute. Now, Bryan Forbes was the prolific British film director whose work included The Stepford Wives and The League of Gentlemen. Born John Theobald Clarke in the East End of London, he changed his name when starting out as an actor. After appearing in supporting roles in many films, he moved into screenwriting and then directing. In one of his best-loved movies, Whistle Down the Wind, he cast Alan Bates as an escaped convict who hides out in a barn and is mistaken for Jesus by a group of children, led by the actress Hayley Mills. Hayley says Bryan and his wife Nanette Newman were regular visitors to her family home.
I always felt that we were close friends. I saw him a lot when I was a child. They used to come down for weekends, the country, and then Bryan directed me in the film Whistle Down the Wind, which was taken from the book that my mother wrote of that name. It was very fortunate that he directed that movie because he was wonderful with actors, having been, and still being an actor himself. It was quite an uncomfortable film to make because it was all on location in Lancashire, on a very remote farm at the foot of the Pendle Hills.
That ain't Jesus? Well, it is then, Mr. Cleverdick. Jesus wore a long dress. Well, that was in them days. And listen, it's a secret. You're not to tell anyone, because we don't know yet what he wants us to do.
It was a wonderful experience because Bryan and Nanette were there a lot, and my mother and father, of course, and Richard Attenborough, who was the producer. There was a lot of wine flowed, a lot of fun, a lot of jokes. Of course, he was also a very, very good, clever, talented writer.
They were all ex-army officers. But beyond that, they had only two things in common: a guilty past and a hopeless future. They had nothing to lose by joining the League of Gentlemen.
It wasn't a surprise he went to Hollywood. I mean, he was a very talented man.
I was frightened, and yet I wanted to accept the challenge because I think if you're a Catholic, you have to go to Rome once, and Hollywood is really Genesis where the film industry is concerned.
Joanna, I think that's what's going on in Stepford. I think there's something in the water that turns us into housefrows, drones, whatever you want to call it.
He was a very lucky man. He had a lot of passions that he was able to pursue. But embodied in that not large frame was tremendous energy, tremendous warmth, tremendous enthusiasm. Even when I last saw him, he was still cracking jokes and, taking serious life very lightly.
Hayley Mills with her memories of Bryan Forbes. Well, I'm joined now by Ian Christie, who is Professor of Film History at Birkbeck College. Can we talk about one of his early films? This is The Angry Silence, Ian. It's a very political film, isn't it?
It is. It's a film about a worker who's sent to Coventry by all his fellow workers for refusing to join the strike. And it's a film which I think leaves a rather nasty taste in the mouth. Well, depends where you're coming from, I suppose. But it's certainly a film that points the finger at what was seen to be all-weaning union power at this time.
And so was that reflective of Bryan's own politics, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure, because if you look at another script he wrote in the same year, The League of Gentlemen, which we've just heard, that's a pretty, that's a poke at the establishment. It's showing that the establishment is made up of not very good chaps. So I think there's a bit of, dishing it out on both sides. I suppose you would say he comes over as rather apolitical in the films, but I do think The Angry Silence, which he made in partnership with Richard Attenborough, is a film that does leave this rather unpleasant feeling.
We've mentioned a number of titles of his films. Which do you think are his best work?
Well, I think it's an extraordinary group of films that he directed. I mean, he was a hyphenate, as you've said, as they say in Hollywood. He wrote, he acted, he directed. But there are three amazing films he made at the beginning of the 60s. Whistle Down the Wind, which is a tremendous film that grows in sort of richness and depth as time passes. The L-Shaped Room, a film that's often left out of that wonderful period of British filmmaking at the beginning of the 60s. It shows a young woman coming to London to have a baby and the strange people she meets. And it's a wonderful film about the strangeness of coming to London. And then he also made Seance on a Wet Afternoon. And I looked at that recently, and I must say I think it's an amazing film. It's about a group of spiritualists, again set in London. And it's got a fantastic performance by Kim Stanley. And one thing he could do was get wonderful performances from a tremendous range of actors, both elderly women, Edith Evans in The Whisperers, right down to children like Hayley Mills.
We should talk about him as a producer too, because there was a time when he was effectively the British film industry, wasn't there?
For 2.5 years or so, he had that unhappy role. He was head of production at EMI, as it then was, and he said of that period, at first they think you can walk on water. After a few weeks, they think you can't even swim.
How many films did he make when he was doing that job?
He oversaw about 11 films, and most of them, I think, are...
In 2.5 years?
They're fairly forgettable, except one in particular has become a real classic, and that's The Railway Children. And The Tales of Beatrix Potter, again, is a perennial. It keeps coming back, so it's not all disgrace.
So did he make some really terrible films? Alongside these wonders that you've been talking about.
Yes, I think it's better to concentrate on the best. I don't think there's a lot to be said for International Velvet or for The Slipper and the Rose. Those were the kind of films that I think got him really a bad reputation. And the sad thing is that if you think about, the great British filmmakers, his name doesn't really rise to the top. And yet when you look at the sheer productivity, the sheer number of scripts he wrote, and he must have been a very capable scriptwriter. And when it all came together, I think there are half a dozen films that nobody would be ashamed of and that are among the very best produced in Britain.
I read one article suggesting that if he'd been left-wing, he might have been knighted by now. Do you think that's an unfair way of putting it?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. If he'd been left-wing and come from the north and made a few films outside London in the north, then yes, he might well have a place in the Hall of Fame. But as it is, I think he will be gradually rediscovered.
The reputation will grow, you think?
I think it will. Sadly, a death often brings a reappraisal. People are going to start looking at some of those films, particularly from the early 60s, and they're going to see that there are remarkable qualities in them, which sometimes were recognised abroad, as is usually the way, if not in Britain.
Ian Christie, thank you very much indeed. He was remembering Bryan Forbes. But now we take you to BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's more or less in half an hour.